Alright, what's up guys? My name is Zach, and today I am driving a 1976 Checker A12 Marathon. Up front is a 4.1 liter inline 6, and down below is a 3-speed automatic transmission. Now I am super excited to be driving this car because it is a Checker Marathon. Now Checker used to be an auto company here in the United States that made almost exclusively cab vehicles from the 1920s until the early 1980s. Now I say almost exclusively because this is actually an A12, which was the designation for the civilian model. So back in 1976, or actually as we'll find out, 1977, someone in California just bought this from a dealership as their personal vehicle. And so I am so incredibly excited to dive into this with you today and share one of the forgotten cars of our American history. But if you would like to share your vehicle with me, you can head on over to my website, zackpradel.com/submit. It's a quick and easy submission form, takes under a minute to fill out, and I come out to you. But let's get back to that straight 6 under the hood, displacing 4.1 liters, or really, it's a 250. I always say liters of displacement in my videos for consistency, so you can easily compare sizes. But this was known as the 250, and it's actually a GM engine. So pretty much the whole drivetrain is from Chevy. Besides the steering was actually all Checker, which is kind of interesting, but the engine is most certainly Chevy. It's fine, it's a little lopey and lazy, and it's really based off of a 1960s design, as you'll come to find out with the rest of this car. And it's slow. It's very, very slow, but that wasn't really the point. These were meant to idle and run all day, and so they were famed for their reliability. This was the Crown Victoria before the Crown Victoria was the Crown Victoria. And so maybe that's why someone would buy these for a personal vehicle, is they want the ruggedness and the durability, because this is one of the most reliable American vehicles you could buy at the time. Now, like I said, paired to it is a 3-speed auto. It's still functioning, it's still shifting gears, and that's all I can ask for it here now, almost 50 years later. Last but not least, the Checker Marathon is rear-wheel drive. So how does it feel to drive a Checker? Well, it drives like a 50s car, because that's really when this car was conceptualized. If you can tell by the styling, you can tell by the design, this really is just a 50s car that they kept producing. It's the closest we got here in America to a communist car, like the Lada or like the Wartburg, where they just kept making them and making them and making them until something happened in the government. However, we will talk about Checker's story more towards the end. I want to give a good overview of the vehicle, and then we'll talk about that, but that does play in. With that stuff out of the way, let's talk about the interior. Well, in front of me, I do have a fuel gauge and speedometer, both of which say Checker, which is just so cool to see. One really cool thing about the gauge cluster is that I actually do have a door ajar light, which works for the front and rear doors. Obviously, if you're a taxi driver, you want to make sure the doors are closed, and it's just something you really didn't see of this era. Now it's pretty common that the car will tell you that a door is open, but not in 1976. Another thing is when you turn on the high beams, which is a floor-mounted switch, it actually says high beams on the dash instead of just having a little blue light icon. I also do have my lights off to the left, my temperature in the center. Now this is just for the heat, because the air conditioning was actually added later. On the steering wheel, don't get anything, although I do have a horn. That's like every sitcom, like, you know, the girl is leaving and she's about to get in the cab, and the guy says, don't go, and you hear this in the background. And she's like, well, I gotta catch my cab. That's it. That's so cool. Off to the left, I do have an air vent that I can pull out, as well as the brake release, and moving on to the door, I just have manual cranks for the windows. However, as time went on, the Checker companies started losing money, and so they started taking away features from the Checker cab with nearly every passing year, and something was the door stop. So when you open the driver's door, there's nothing stopping it from swinging back and hitting you if there's a breeze. Now the back doors get those, but the front doors don't, to save money, because the cab driver wasn't in and out of the vehicle all day. The rear doors were being used all day. So kind of an interesting cost-saving measure by Checker on the front doors. Moving into the center, I get an AM-only radio, a little ashtray and cigarette lighter, and then this is our added-in AC. Now, this is Checker-specific AC, but it was one of those options that you could just check a box, and back in 1976, they weren't really integrated into the dash all that well, so this was just kind of stuck on the bottom, either by the manufacturer or dealer, I'm not totally sure, but one of the two to give you AC. Then we don't get anything in the center console. I get no cup holders, so unfortunately, the only Checker I've ever reviewed fails the big friggin' bottle test. However, we have to talk about the bench seats. There is a middle seat belt, so this can carry 6 passengers, and it is pretty comfortable. I would imagine being a taxi driver, I wouldn't mind sitting here all day. At least, I don't think. Now, I wouldn't like dealing with the people all day, but sitting in the seat wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. However, speaking of seats, we do have back seats, so let's go do a back seat review, because that's where you want to be in a Checker Marathon. So even just getting in, you could see the door actually will stop. When you open it, there's a little lock that sort of helps that. But getting in the back here, you have so much room. I mean, so much room. Closing it up here. Oh, this is really cool. I do have these very industrial bus grade grab handles here. I do have little ashtrays in the doors. Crank for the window. I have an ashtray in the center as well. And this would get like a rubberized flooring back here if this was the taxi variant. But because this was a personal car, they actually gave you some carpet. So luxurious, I know. But I just get lap belts back here. Something I forgot to mention with the front seats, as you can see over here, these are big, giant, bulky front seat belts. Now, back in the 70s, the Highway Safety Administration started requiring seat belts, but this was designed in the 50s and 60s, so they never even had the thought of seat belts in that era. So these are so crudely tacked on, but these are original, proper Checker seat belts. But it's so funny that they had to adapt this car that was never meant to have seat belts to have seat belts. So just lap belts back here, pretty much that's it. But I mean, there's just so much space that I could fully sit on the floor and not touch anything around me, which is just spectacular. And just, I'm going to talk about it later, but just the idea of, you know, getting off the plane, which was still a pretty new technology, commercial air flight in the 1970s. Getting off the plane, putting my luggage in the back and getting into one of these and going to see the big city, going into town, going to, you know, see a show. Really, really special. Really special. And I know this was the private car, so this wasn't a taxi, so it was less likely that people did that in this exact variant. But you get the point. The taxi version was 99% the same vehicle, so very, very cool to see. Let's hop out. We'll take a quick look at the trunk to see where your luggage would go, and then we'll talk about the looks. All right, around the back of the Checker Marathon, couple of things I want to note before we do talk about the actual trunk space. First of all, this Checker Marathon badge was just for the civilian models. So you didn't see these on taxi cabs because they were all painted whatever taxi cab company color, and they didn't really bother with the rear marking. So that is a very, very rare badge. The other thing I wanted to note is that the Checker company spent $0 on rust proofing these cars because they were going to be driven for 3 or 4 years, 20 hours a day, no breaks, and by that time they were useless and tossed into a junkyard anyway, so before the rust could get them, probably something else happened to them. So there was no rust protection, so that's why you don't really see these anymore, because they had no protection and they all rusted away within 10 or 15 years. Anyway, sorry, totally forgot to mention that. There's just so much with this car that I keep thinking of other things. But let's hop into the trunk. Square for the ignition, circle for the trunk, just like so many other brands we are familiar with. And once we are back here, tons and tons of space that the owner has utilized, which is fantastic. However, it's so funny. This thing opens with the might of Zeus. I mean, look at this. Ready? I mean, it is insane. So rubberized floor mat in here, you know, just to keep it a little bit normal. But other than that, nothing crazy about the back of the Checker Marathon. Now we got to talk about the looks. And obviously this looks way older than in 1976. It looks like something out of the 50s. And that's because it pretty much is. That's when it was designed, and Checker stuck with the design until they closed their doors. So this is it. However, something interesting, like I talked about with the door stops on the interior, is that as time went on, as Checker was losing money and they were less and less profitable each year, they started taking away chrome. So you can always tell how old a Checker is by the headlight design. They did change that and stuff. But with each passing year, there's less chrome. So by the end of it, the only chrome object found on the car was actually just the hood ornament. So an interesting little tidbit there. And so, with all of that being said, let's get on to my final thoughts. Now that you have a good idea of what it is, what it's like to drive, and the intricacies of the interior and exterior, let's talk about Checker as a whole. Well, like I said, they opened up their doors in 1922. A lot of people don't know that, and here's a visual graphic of the Checker vehicles throughout the era. Now, most of these vehicles are actually fully extinct with no surviving models around. The Checker company was actually built and designed specifically to build cabs because it was named after the Checker Cab Company. So there was a cab company in Chicago called Checker Cabs, and so they named the manufacturer after the cab company. It's a little backwards and a little weird that the cab company came first, then the manufacturer came. And so throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, they produced cabs for cab companies. You see them in a lot of movies. That famous scene with the ghost cab driver from Ghostbusters. He's getting in the back of a Checker cab. Any movie that takes place in New York, Los Angeles, or Chicago of this era, you saw these Checker cabs all around. And a lot of people, myself included, never really took note of them because they figured, oh, that's just a year of the Impala that I don't know, or year of the Chevy Bel Air, or year of the Ford Fairlane that I'm not familiar with. It's easy to slip into the background. You wouldn't even notice that. I didn't know that Checker was its own independent company built in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I thought for sure these were built by one of the three big manufacturers, but they weren't. And so when they died off in the early 80s, they actually weren't absorbed by anyone. They weren't absorbed into Chrysler or AMC at the time, or Chevy didn't buy them, Ford didn't buy them. They just dissolved because less and less people were purchasing their cabs. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, they couldn't keep the lights on. So I can't reiterate enough how cool and special it is to be driving a Checker. And I love this part of my job. What I get to do today is put on my historian cap and show you in full high definition of what these cabs were like. And so I want to show a couple things here. I'm going to show it on screen. This car has some really cool literature that's gone with it from the original owner. This is the original certificate of buying a Checker cab. When was the last time you saw one of those? And hopefully I can preserve some of this information and preserve this video for future generations to figure out what the heck the Checker cabs were. They were such an American icon, an American staple that has soon been forgotten. I've never driven one until today. Well, actually last night, Daniel was kind enough to take me around in it and let me drive it. But I just get to imagine what it was like to visit New York City for the first time and fly into JFK or LaGuardia and have a Checker cab pull up and you fit all your stuff in the trunk and you get the big comfy seats and just seeing the New York City skyline out of these windows for the very first time, or seeing a loved one. Back in the 70s, there wasn't email, there wasn't texting, you couldn't FaceTime your loved ones. If you wanted to see them face to face, you had to get in an airplane or you had to drive a real long way. And this car made that possible. The Checker cab is responsible for so many business meetings and vacations and small special moments. Phoebe from the TV show Friends drove one of these, and they used it as a comedic shtick. So that is why I am over the moon to take a look at Daniel's Checker cab. And that's actually the reason I flew out here to Oregon just to drive this car. And I have to say, it doesn't let down. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Huge thank you to Daniel for letting me take out his Checker Marathon. Such a cool and interesting and just special automobile. Daniel has been absolutely awesome to work with. I'm filming a couple of his vehicles here today, and I am so appreciative of him, his whole car club, and his generosity. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to rate the video, comment on the video, and subscribe if you really liked it. Take care, guys.